Hey everyone, surprise. The numbers have come in and I have seen that people in the step back community have definitely wanted Quick Step to come back. I had a bit of a think about it and I realized that these videos did play an important role. We're talking about things that are going on in modern day with a strong historical context and really understanding the present through the prism of the past. That's what Step Back is all about. And the Step Back videos do that to an extent, but I think that it's good to do this a little bit more off the cuff and regularly in order to talk about like things going on right this moment. And yeah, it's going to be on Saturdays from now on. Now, the first story I'm going to talk about, of course, is the story that's on everybody's tongues. It's on the news, and it has been a rather traumatic experience for many women and men who have been victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment. We're going to talk about Brett Kavanaugh and how the MeToo movement is actually something that is decades old, and how the entitlement of privileged white men to other people's bodies is very old and something that we have been fighting for a very, very long time. I always do the happy subjects, don't I? So first of all, I think we need to talk about sexual assault and sexual harassment in the larger scope. As long as there have been gender-based hierarchies, or really class hierarchies, there has been sexual coercion and sexual harassment. It's almost as if there's some sort of aspect to hierarchies that is toxic to human personalities. But I think that that's a little bit of an aside from this video. Whether it be domestic servants, slaves, women and men have been made victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment from mostly men, let's be frank, almost entirely men, who were their superiors, pretty much as long as there have been superiors. So as long as there has been farming, really. There was always mistreatment in the workplace, especially towards women, and especially from men. I think that we really need to reiterate that over and over and over again. Cases where this got especially bad, I'm sure you have many times heard about this in history, is things like servants and slaves. Domestic workers in the American North, for example, were commonly targeted for sexual harassment, and the sexual harassment and the sexual assault of slaves is legendary in the South. I think that it was a thing that everybody knew about in the enslaved South, but it was a thing that nobody talked about. And it didn't even stop after the Civil War. Sharecroppers were often victims of sexual coercion, and in everyone's minds, but never on people's lips. And this also followed society when women started to become more consistent workers in the workplace. Women who entered the workplace in the early 20th century tended to enter into positions such as clerical work and manufacturing, often jobs that have very strong hierarchies, and women were fairly often targeted for sexual coercion, harassment, and assault, usually from their supervisors. And the union movement, while it did a lot of really great things for preventing women from being put into dangerous work, didn't really do much about sexual assault and sexual harassment. For the most part, they thought a lot like Jordan Peterson. They thought that it was just a fact of life that we had to put up with. Fairly often, women were recommended that they should quit their job if they can't handle sexual harassment, sexual assault. If you want a really good example of how sexual harassment and sexual assault was considered just part of everyday life for a long time, you should watch the first episode of Mad Men. Fairly often their complaints were dismissed as trivial or harmless. And women were discouraged from talking openly about this. So it was just sort of this unspoken fact of life. Very much like I mentioned about the role of sexual coercion and sexual assault in the South when slavery was common. But this became a more pressing issue as more and more women entered the workforce, especially in the 1960s and the 1970s. This is where we're going to zoom in on the American example because I'm a US historian and that's how I work, and over 40% of you, which is the majority by about 30%, are Americans, so yeah, it's going to be the default. Sorry. But by the mid-70s, the women's liberation movement, which in academic vernacular we now call second wave feminism, was in full swing, and they took the subject of sexual harassment very seriously. And as the second wave feminist movement did, they didn't really focus that much on culture. They focused on trying to find legalistic answers to their solutions. It's sort of one of the big divisions between second and third wave feminism. Second wave feminists focused more on trying to win legal victories, constitutional amendments, laws, things like that, while third wave feminism is more about embracing a diversity of women's perspectives and also fighting the cultural battle. Very well in time with the development of cultural theory. Anyways, the second wave feminists started to critique the justice system and try to change a legal structure that was really not focused around women's consent. This is where you started to find a lot of movements that increased laws against rape, against battering women, especially battering wives. That was sort of a thing that wasn't enforced too heavily, but second wave feminists fought well on that front. And they did something which has become a little bit more common these days, which is consciousness raising, which is when, even if you don't win legal victories, by fighting the fight itself, you are getting attention towards your issue and you are changing the cultural consciousness around a subject. And the other thing that happens in this case is it means that it's something that people can actually talk about. You have opened up the dialogue to new people, and women who are experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace and experiencing sexual assault at the workplace have now the language to talk about it. It wasn't just a thing they were going through. It was something we could discuss and something we could fight against, which is another part of consciousness raising. And so women started telling their stories in the 1970s. Here's an example of consciousness raising. The term sexual harassment was coined in 1975 by a group of women who were trying to sue Cornell University. There was one former employer who quit because she was being harassed at the workplace, and the people at Cornell refused to pay her her unemployment benefits because they said that she had quit for personal reasons. She was experiencing inappropriate touching from her supervisor, and she requested a transfer, and when she was denied that transfer, she quit. This group, called Working Women United, actually started to get attention on the news, and the idea of sexual harassment started to really take hold as a part of our collective consciousness. As I said, consciousness raising. And it came to full fruition when the New York Times used sexual harassment as one of its headlines. And things escalated from there. In 1976, a survey came out that said that 80% of women had experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. And another thing to point out is that with greater awareness, there was also a growing and angry pushback. A lot of men, but also some prominent women, especially anti-feminist crusader Phyllis Schlafly, who, she's a person, were criticizing women who were being sexually harassed in the workplace, saying that they were asking for it. And in the 1980s, actually a lot of the development that happened around sexual harassment started to backslide. Phyllis Schlafly actually used to say that virtuous women were seldom harassed. Really, just a charming person. But yeah, sexual harassment did have a comeback in a way as white men started to reassert their dominance in the 1980s. Yeah, the 1980s was a bad time. Now is a bad time as well. However, still some prominent second wave feminists in the 80s made some progress in developing the legal definition of sexual harassment. Some famous lawyers like Catherine McKinnon started to make distinctions about how sexual harassment works, made different categories, and started to formalize punishments against it. For example, this was when they made the distinction between creating a hostile working environment versus like actual sexual quid pro quo type things, and made those two distinct forms of sexual harassment. Quid pro quo is when sexual favors were offered in exchange for career advancement, basically. Another example would be Eleanor Holmes Norton, who made the successful case that sexual harassment was a violation of women's rights. People would say these women were ahead of their time, but I really like this quote from Lindsay Ellis, which is, "They weren't ahead of their time, they were ahead of our time." And yeah, by the late 70s, sexual harassment had been defended in court and had been prosecuted under several occasions to be a violation of Article 8 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Another thing that Brett Kavanaugh is very quickly likely to try and strip clean. Yep, abortion, segregation, all those things. If Brett Kavanaugh gets through, expect all of them to slowly disappear. And of course, there was the big and famous case of Anita Hill. So this is going to be much more familiar to you. In 1991, Clarence Thomas, a judge, was going to be appointed to the Supreme Court by George H.W. Bush. While he was going through his confirmation hearings, a woman named Anita Hill came out and said that Clarence Thomas had been sexually harassing her. There was a hearing. She went to the Senate, and holy moly, it was one of the most brutal and nastiest and most white male entitled set of questions that anybody could ever see. The Judiciary Committee was all white men. Actually, it has never not been all white men. And despite her having a very good case, they voted in Clarence Thomas anyway. But since then, Anita Hill's testimony has been well regarded as an example of just how bad the rape culture in America can be. These male members of the Judiciary Committee felt extremely threatened by any questioning of their entitlement to women's bodies. And in the 1990s, there was a large explosion of sexual harassment suits and cases, and things looked actually kind of like they were going in the right direction for a while. In 1998, the Supreme Court said that same-sex harassment was also considered a workplace crime. And then things went quiet for a while. That is, until, of course, a sexual assaulter, someone who bragged about it on tape, was elected president of the United States. Something makes me think that collectively women around the US and the world had finally had enough of this bullshit. And then starting a little over a year ago with cases like Kevin Spacey and Harvey Weinstein, the MeToo movement started up. And many prominent celebrities have been exposed to be kind of terrible people. And so it was looking like maybe we'll make some progress. Maybe this culture of rape and sexual harassment and sexual assault might finally be exposed. We might actually turn over all of these rocks and we might make some real progress, even if Donald Trump was still president. And then we had Brett Kavanaugh. Last week, Brett Kavanaugh had his Senate hearing for his Supreme Court nomination, and he has been accused in the meantime by no less than 3 women of sexual assault, including one powerful testimony by Dr. Blasey Ford last Friday that was basically a tearjerker if you have a soul. She had multiple friends who were able to verify her story. She had notes from a psychiatrist who were able to verify her story. And every time they questioned Brett Kavanaugh about it, he got dodgy and evasive. And right as they were about to circle in on the day of the event and, you know, asking the real tough questions, all of a sudden Lindsey Graham started getting mad and he took up all the air, and all of a sudden they were able to dodge the story. And they managed to push it to a point where they would do an FBI investigation that wrapped up just yesterday as I'm filming it. But they're planning on doing a vote on Brett Kavanaugh over the weekend, and I'll be frank, I'm not optimistic. And I think that this is a point where we are seeing a movement to try and advance the cause of women's rights, especially their rights to bodily autonomy, which you'd think would be a given, but of course we live in the darkest timeline, so of course it's not happening. And it's meeting with a very white, very cisgendered, heterosexual male backlash. This is a thing that we have been seeing for several years now. I think that it has shown to be the most prevalent when there was a literal harassment campaign against women who were working in the video games industry disguised as a movement to fix journalism or ethics in journalism or whatever like facade they're putting up, and has been building ever since. The MGTOWs, the men's rights, the Rouge V's, and the Sargon of Accads out there who are basically exemplifying the white male backlash against social progress that has happened, what little there has happened in the last few decades. Sometimes the last few centuries. Didn't Return of Kings not believe in women's suffrage or something? Either way, Brett Kavanaugh is all of these things coming to a head, and that's why everything in the news has been so dramatic around him. So there's this fight to retain white male privilege at any expense, including getting a sexual assaulter nominated to the Supreme Court. We saw things like this in the 1980s. We saw things like this in the anti-suffrage movement. It is a regular thing that comes up. There's always going to be a revanchist backlash against any form of social progress. And of course, Brett Kavanaugh represents more than just this backlash against victims of sexual assault. He also represents a multi-decade-long conservative plan in order to adopt a far-right Supreme Court. And he would be the last piece that would allow a 5-4 majority to basically undo every major American civil rights victory since 1865. And yeah, I do think that things like women's suffrage could be up for debate in a far-right Supreme Court. I think the biggest one that people are talking about, though, is Roe v. Wade, women's right to bodily autonomy all over again. There are a lot of right-wing people in America who want to live out their Handmaid's Tale fantasy for America and impose their religious worldview on other people, so they need Brett Kavanaugh to win, even if he is a horrible sexual assaulter. And it's 2018. There's going to be an election next month, and the Democrats are looking to at least take the House and possibly the Senate, although it's looking less likely. And so I think a lot of Republicans know that if it isn't Brett Kavanaugh, they're not going to have time to get another person jammed through the system before this election, which is super ironic if you think about how they reacted during the Merrick Garland confirmation, but a story for another time. Anyways, it's good to be back. It's good to rant in front of a camera and see what comes out of it at the end. Thank you guys so much for enduring my experiments, and yeah, like and share and subscribe, and if you want to see this series continue, please let me know in the comments. Anyways, take care.